This is JB Cast, and I'm Nafisa Hoodboy. Our program today is in English because our speakers are native English speakers. We are going to speak about the sharp divisiveness in US history, which actually came to the fore when there was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump recently. What we would like to talk to our speakers about is how this attempt on Trump's life changes the trajectory of US politics, if indeed it does or not. I'm going to start with Associate Professor of Political Science in Georgia State University, Professor Henry Chip Carey. And Professor Carey, the primary question is that politics has been so polarized in America. What do you think this latest incident and this attempted assassination does to politics inside the US?
I think that it's not likely to have long-term impacts. In the past, such as Ronald Reagan's survival of an assassination attempt, he got a lot of sympathy for a couple of weeks, and then the basic mechanics of that election took over. The same thing happened with a few other presidencies. They used to say a week is a lifetime in American politics. The structure of politics is polarized, and some political scientists say it's also crystallized, which is a little bit different than the divisiveness. It says the positions that people are divided over are hard, and there are very few people who float between the parties or candidacies or haven't made their minds up. That's why in the last two elections, Trump won by 80,000 votes in 3 states, and Biden won by 50,000 votes in 4 states. And they ended up being electoral college landslides because of the absurd electoral college electoral system that we have. But it's going to be a very close election. Right now, out of the 5 battleground states, some people include 6, 2 seem to be very big margins for Trump. So people are claiming a landslide. But in the other 4 states, it's within the margin of errors that statistics gives us at 98% confidence, assuming your samples are representative and randomly drawn for sample size. I do think that there'll be a bounce in favor of Trump even more, but it'll be ephemeral. The main issue is, can the press and the campaigns shift the focus on issues like Biden's age to other issues, most importantly, Trump and his record in office, which is highly controversial and divisive, but also alienating to that small sliver of voters. Some people say they're focused on Nikki Haley voters, primarily women in the suburbs, or they're focused on Latin American and African American voters who are tilting towards Trump, but particularly among men, because both those groups have a huge educational and income gender gap. And the men tend to vote for Trump more than the women do, who are African American and Latinos. And there are other such groups that, such as those who are sampled in surveys that were scandalized by the January 6th violent attack that was clearly organized by some of Trump's closest advisors, some of them formally employed, some of them not.
Yes, I'm going to stop you right here, Professor Carey, because we need to bring in Lyman Baker, who's instructor emeritus from Kansas State University. Lyman, Biden has not been nominated yet to become president. And in fact, there is a great deal of hesitation within the Democratic Party camp as to whether he should be nominated. Given the number of stumbles he's made, he seems to be in declining health, and that was manifested in the last electoral debate that he had with Trump. How much of a problem has Biden become for the Democratic Party? And do you expect him to be nominated?
I think it's a big problem, and you have a number of people, activists on both sides, who are in disagreement with each other. So one point of divisiveness that we have is within the Democratic Party. If you have somebody like Nancy Pelosi, who's reported to be working behind the scenes to get Biden to resign his candidacy, on the one hand, and then you have plenty of people who are very influential writers of newsletters, for example, saying it would be absolutely stupid to try to change horses at this point. Then it's really up in the air. And I think that, I mean, my guess is that if we want to call it that, the authoritarian features of the national political leadership are going to prevail in the nomination process. I think they're going to be able to. The people around Biden are going to be able to fend off this challenge. But if you have somebody like Nancy Pelosi, I mean, that's really get you to sit back and notice. I'd be reluctant to predict, but I think it's probable that he's going to be the candidate. And as Professor Carey said, the politics in the United States is strikingly amnesiac. If you wait another 4 6 weeks, this will not be in the forefront of their minds any more than the assassination. At the same time, it is going to make a difference what the media do. If they get off this business about trying to feature every gaffe of Biden and talk about the lies of Trump as he tries to dissociate himself from this is one kind of lie from this Project 2025, then that would be something that might contribute to Biden's better chances.
Professor Carey, we know that Trump was nominated by his party, and he's also nominated his vice president, which is J.D. Vance. What type of a perspective do these two people take internationally? For example, how afraid should NATO be? How afraid should the rest of the world be that if Trump and his team are elected, they will follow a isolationist path, which is starting to become apparent in their ideologies?
Well, it's hard to make predictions, and a fool would make predictions about exactly what will transpire based on what he says. And sometimes leaders who say crazy things actually do them, Hitler being the cliche for that sort of thing. And wasn't taken seriously by many people. In retrospect, looked foolish. But if you take him at his word, Ukraine will be conquered by Russia because he will stop all U.S. weapons to Ukraine, and NATO countries, including all the EU member countries, don't have the commitment and the defense spending and the technological sophistication that the United States is providing as part of the NATO support for Ukraine's defense against Russia. And he could conceivably pull out of NATO if things got quite harsh. On the other hand, there is a defense department that has got standard operating procedures, part of what President Eisenhower's farewell address called, the military-industrial complex, and that's not going away either. The U.S. has strong institutions that can't necessarily be overrun. But we've got a Supreme Court now that has just basically said the president can order a genocide or a political assassination, and you can't even subpoena the evidence for it because that's part of the immunity coverage that a 5-4 majority voted for, with Amy Coney Barrett dissenting on the evidence issue and joining them on the other dimensions of immunity. So who knows, with this new incentive where Trump's been emboldened to say, it was a political witch hunt because judges are starting to throw out these cases because they have to throw out all the evidence that was used, for example, of the 34 felony convictions he got in New York State on the hush money payments that were characterized as legal fees. So we are in a situation where there are some really strong incentives for abuse of power that have never been imagined in U.S. history. So he's authoritarian for sure. He says he wants to be a dictator. He says he wants to stop supporting Ukraine. He says that he can make peace with Putin. Well, how would you make peace with Putin? By giving him Ukraine. And that might also threaten the other NATO member countries. And all Trump has to do is pull out of the NATO treaty, not to be bound by the obligation of a one attack against one is to attack against everyone. So there are lots of reasons to say that, like the survival of democracy itself in the United States, there are many things that are much more likely, that are horrific in theory. It's not to say it's more likely than not to happen, but it's much more likely to happen now than it has ever happened since World War II.
Professor Lyman, as they say, U.S. voters are between a rock and a hard place. We know the way that Biden has turned a blind eye to what's been going on in the Gaza and West Bank, where thousands and thousands of Palestinians have been killed. And apparently the Israeli prime minister has turned a deaf ear to whatever Biden appears to say. How much is this going to cost him the election? I mean, apart from all the gaffes which are now in public view, how much does this affect the way voters now respond at the polls to Biden?
Well, again, it's hard to predict, but as I understand it, Biden is, and his people on both sides of that other split I told you about are aware that the Muslim and Arab vote in the coming election is likely to be very important, and that the Jewish vote will be important. So, and of course, within the Jewish community in the United States, there's also a division between people who, for example, support Jewish Voice for Peace, and people who have thrown in with the AIPAC, you know, and then the Anti-Defamation League, which are just, you know, committed to the idea that if you criticize the policy of Israel, you're anti-Semitic. That, of course, has the unfortunate fact of encouraging some people to be anti-Semitic, and to overlook the fact that inside Israel itself, there's plenty of division about what's going on. And that you know, if Netanyahu were to stop this war, he would face an election that would be the end of his political career and subject him to prosecution for corruption. So he's in it for the long haul. The question is whether well, if we go back to the other part of it, if Biden, given Biden's position on Israel, drawing a red line repeatedly and then forgetting it, right? It's not to be wondered at that people whose relatives are being killed and friends are being killed would be have their heels dug in about voting for a man like that. And from a lot of people's standpoint, it looks like, and here I'm speaking just as a as a layperson looking at the landscape. It looks like this is a contest between two criminals. You know, one is a war criminal. The other one is a criminal already in many respects, domestically, and has made it clear that he would support Netanyahu even more avidly than Biden has. And where that goes, it's anybody's guess.
Exactly. Professor Carey, we saw some very dramatic scenes when the shots ran out, and Trump was bleeding from one ear, and then he put his fist up and he said, "Fight, fight." And I was intrigued by the fact that someone said all this is third world stuff. And you yourself have worked in Pakistan and been to different electoral scenarios. Also, we see the courts, as you yourself mentioned, we see the courts going back and forth in the US, which apparently to many would look like they are acting without regard for rule of law. How much what parallels can you draw between what you see, what's happening in the US right now, and what happens generally in third world countries, including Pakistan?
We are definitely in an authoritarian direction. Each authoritarian regime, be you call it an illiberal democracy or a competitive authoritarian regime, people use both terms for Pakistan. We're already an illiberal democracy, and Freedom House, which is generally a pro-US non-governmental organization ranking every country in the world, including the United States, has kept the US off the highest scores for civil and political rights for about 4 or 5 years now. And various other academic indices have kept the United States in a semi-democracy. Democracy is still the noun, but there's so many illiberal rule by law rather than rule of law daily governance, and it's getting worse rather than better. The army is the big power structure behind the scenes, along with their various intelligence agencies in Pakistani politics. It's not like they determine every single election, but they may indicate their preferences and they have a way of getting their way. In the United States, the army is much more apolitical, and the intelligence agencies are apolitical. Although you could say they were on the side of democracy because they simply refused to execute the orders that Trump had wanted, even though he did manage to find in one political rally in July of 2020 to clear out Lafayette Square with reportedly the Custom and Border Patrol secret police that didn't have insignias on their. They were without insignias, without uniforms. They were plainclothes people that used tear gas so that Trump could have a photo op in front of a church. If you recall that incident from 4 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump is clearly got one thing in common with some Pakistani leaders and leaders all over the world, including Philippines, South Korea. In Europe, we have the former Polish government, the current Orban government for over a decade in Hungary, and Erdogan in Turkey, and others that sometimes referred with Weber's unfortunate term as sultanistic, as if it's Orientalist to use the term sultan, but the idea is it's a highly patrimonial, corrupt, personalist rule. And Trump has basically used the White House to make money in his first term in office in ways that are quite extraordinary. And he was surrounded by people who were recommended for investigation, 6 cabinet officers. And he had his attorney general order all the investigations shut down. And these guys were real grifters who came into government to make money. And, not to mention how much money Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, made from the Saudi and other Gulf state governments in his venture. Well, it wasn't a venture capital fund; it was an investment fund. And on January 6th, he was out collecting these funds in a really blatant, outrageous form of corruption, to say nothing of how Trump handled his office, both in corrupt financial ways, but also obviously retaining documents that clearly was a slam dunk illegal set of activity to say that he turned everything in and after he was out of office, and then kept hiding them. And the January 6th events himself. So these are variations on a theme. And because Trump was obstructed by the court, because this same Supreme Court was not willing to allow him defraud the election, steal it in a way that would have been done more covertly and subtly in Pakistan, and has been done subtly and covertly in Pakistan historically, where the army would signal who would form the next government if, after settled rigging, that might have been done just to have an adequate number of seats. With the parliamentary system and the coalition system that usually forms governments in Pakistan, it's easier to signal the military's preferences and then dismiss the government through presidential edict that was legalized through an authoritarian provision of the Pakistani constitution. The next time, this Supreme Court will not rule on federal law, they'll rule on state law, and the states have now changed their laws to make it possible to send fraudulent electors to the Electoral College, something that Vice President Pence was not willing to countenance because they'd already sent the proper electors the first time. New York Times had an article about a week ago, maybe less, that said the Republican National Committee is preparing steadily to begin with lawsuits, but if they get obstructed, then violence would be the next alternative for the Trump administration.
Professor Lyman, let's speak much more internationally, because this is what our audience would like to hear about. How keen is Russia to have President Trump in power? Because obviously there is a shift towards isolationism, as has been talked about. But at the same time, we see that there is growing tension, for example, with Iran. In fact, many people say that because Soleimani, the Iranian commander, was assassinated, that this current attack on Trump was a form of retaliation. So for the rest of the world, and by the rest of the world, I mean China, Russia, which are the big powers, how keen are they to avoid Biden?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, again, we have the question of whether Trump means what he says. It would seem that his promises to impose tariffs on everything from China and to pretend that hurts China. Of course, it's American consumers who pay that tax. If he were to do that, that would be costly to China as well, right? At the same time, there is the question of China, of let's say Taiwan, Japan, Korea, the Philippines. The projection of the Chinese military force into that part of the Pacific is of great concern to the U.S. military, and so it's if you want, we can say we from the standpoint of many progressives, maybe we'll be saved by the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower rightly complained of, or not, But I think there is a concern on the part of the Chinese. There is a concern, surely, on the part of the Chinese to avoid open warfare, and they are operating under the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, that are appropriately acronym MAD, which is actually sane, I suppose, when you have nuclear powers. It's the only thing that prevented let's say the Cold War from being a hot war. And there's an important analyst that I'm sure Professor Carey is aware about, by the name of Graham Allison, who's pointed to something that he calls the Thucydides trap, about what happens when you have an ascendant imperial power challenging the hegemony of a traditional power. And this is what happened, according to Thucydides, in the Peloponnesian War, when the Spartans became alarmed by the measures that Athens was taking to defend against Persia. And they'd been allies before, right? Just like the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies during World War II. But this came apart. In the case of the Peloponnesian War, it wasn't a Cold War. because there wasn't anything to each side tried to bring the other to its knees with everything it had. It didn't have atomic weapons, neither one. But the Chinese are reading that book by Allison, you can bet. And every person, not just on the chief of staff, but probably everybody at West Point and Annapolis and the Air Force Academy are reading it as well.
It's certainly clear that Russia wants Trump to win. They're trying to help him to win. They've interfered in European elections in recent years as well with tremendous amounts of contributions to right-wing parties. They're trying to win the election by divide and rule, by pitting one group against another, which makes the incumbent look incompetent. They've also advanced on the battlefield, which is bound to reduce the support for the war in the United States. Trump's isolationism suits Putin just fine, and they'll create an authoritarian alliance in a worst-case scenario against democracy. It's very clear Trump personally prefers strong leaders who tend to be dictators or illiberal Democrats who are only interested in the rule of law when it suits them, but against it when it's inconvenient. And that, is a situation that is perilous for the rest of the world. It could be perilous because who knows what problems for South Asia and Pakistan in particular could be presented by provocations from Moscow with their imperial appetite whetted. This is the reinstitution of empire that was lost at the end of the Soviet Union in December 25th, 1991. Ukraine is the big immediate target among those 15 former Soviet socialist republics. And Afghanistan was right on the backyard of Pakistan. And there's no reason to think that Russia wouldn't want to cause mischief for Pakistan and Afghanistan.
But
it just suited their purpose.
But Professor Carey, and we are winding up, and I'll give you the last word. Domestically, because guns are used very frequently in America to settle disputes. And there are plenty of people who are opposed to the way Trump proceeds. He's a dictator, as you said. And the use of the gun against him was, again, a symbol of how polarized the society is.
Well, I mean, that the gunman's motives are not clear yet, but J.D. Vance tonight got a rousing roar when he said his grandmother died with something like 15 or 18 handguns in her house. And she, because she was disabled, needed a handgun probably in every corner of every room for a house. And
absolutely. So domestically,
I mean, it's ironic that Trump was the victim of a shooter, but that doesn't, yes, we are polarized over the gun issue, but it doesn't, the hypocrisy of not admitting, well, if they didn't legalize an AR-15, which is basically a de facto automatic weapon that the Supreme Court said is not an automatic weapon and therefore cannot be regulated and cannot be prohibited by state governments in their most recent decision, creates this situation where the Democrats should have a very powerful issue and call Trump's bluff. You were a millimeter away from being murdered in a terrorist act.
Right.
But we can't get the media to focus on that issue yet because the issue of the day is Biden's feebleness.
So I'll give Lyman Baker the last word. What do you expect the next 4 months to be like as November approaches and the political temperature heats up in America?
It's up in the air, I mean, we're talking mostly about people,
Your
the
mic
people
is
who would
off.
do this, the people who would be trying to use using guns to clear out the political landscape, for example, are unhinged people, right? I mean, my way of looking at it is that Trump has been all along trying to recruit his equivalent of the Sturmabteilung in 1930 Germany, the kind of private police force of the Nazis, but it has to do it in such a roundabout way that the people who would do the business are what we'd call stochastic terrorists. You can't predict who that is. You can't give an order to somebody. You can make it clear you'd welcome it, but it's usually some nut who picks up the gun to try to do the will of the leader, and you can't tell where that's coming from, right? And there's no way we can know where it's coming from.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, on that note, let's just wind up today's discussion, and thank you so much for a very informed debate. We had Professor Henry Chip Carey, who is an associate professor of political science at Georgia State University, and Lyman Baker, who is currently in Germany, and he's instructor emeritus at Kansas State University.